Hi guys, tonight I'm going to read you a short story out of Tales from the Lake, Volume 3. It's called The Cruel and it's written by Harper Hull. The first time it happened was the day David Smith fell over his own feet on the way out of the chemistry class. Mark Holland was right behind him, and as David tumbled over and landed hard on his left shoulder, Mark made a sound. It was a horrible whining drone of a sound, somewhere between an old air raid siren and an angry goat. Mark stood over the fallen boy, making the ugly noise, gradually getting louder, until Mrs. the Chemistry came over, put her hand on his shoulder, and with a quiet, exasperated look on her face, told him to stop. Mark went quiet and walked away down the corridor as the teacher helped David get to his feet. The next day, David and Mark were both present during lunch break when the school bully Francis White decided to smash up a lower year kid, Gary Barnshaw, for beating him at marbles. It was out amongst the trees at the rear of the school, a veritable marbling assault course of roots and muddy channels. Francis had the smaller, younger lad in a headlock, and after easily taking him to ground, began punching him in the face with his free hand. Marbles spilled from Gary's blazer pockets as he struggled to get free and rolled in all directions. As usual in these fights, the chant of "fight, fight, fight" started up, and children, boys and girls, came running from all over to witness the beating. In what seemed like absolute harmony, Mark and David opened their mouths and spilled the horrible sound. No. Sounds like pirates. Francis now had a scarlet fist, as Gary's nose was cut and bloody, but the bigger boy kept on pummeling away the sound. No, the bigger boy kept on pummeling away. The sound was taken up by more of the children crowded around. Louder and louder it got, until it seemed everyone standing was taking part, and as Gary lay bloody and crying in the dirt, and Francis finally letting him go, scooped up as many loose marbles as he could find. A large figure pushed through the circle of droning children and began shouting. "That's enough," roared Evans, the bearded, stout deputy headmaster. "Francis White, my office now. Gary, get yourself to the nurse boy. The rest of you, be quiet. Stop that infernal racket and get back inside. Bell goes in 2 minutes. Stop it now." The noise stopped, just like that. The children slowly walked back towards the red-bricked school buildings. Mr. Evans helped Gary up, gave him a handkerchief from his jacket pocket, and shook his head, wondering what new ridiculous trend this group droning thing was. Over the next few days, the lamentation, as the noise was named by Mr. Halby, the English literature teacher, during a discussion in the staff room, occurred more and more. It became a regular part of practically every break and lunchtime. Each successive day it increased in volume as more and more of the children joined the terrible chorus. Mrs. Colback, the elderly school secretary, quit her job because of it, saying it reminded her when the Germans were sending doodlebugs into the skies and raining death down upon the city. Teachers at the end of the school complex would hear the nearer sound rise way off at the other end and rush across to help their fellow staff claim the situation. It was always the same form of trigger. Someone had dropped something, fallen over, started a fight, broken an item, and the hideous, broken, klaxon-like dirge would emanate from the pupils in the vicinity. On Friday during lunch, all the teachers were eating together in the dining room at the staff table. Even Mr. Talbot, the headmaster, had made a rare appearance to dine with his colleagues. He usually just stayed in his office during lunch and ate a Cornish pastry, a bag of cheese, and onion crisps and a Scotch egg, all washed down with a carton of Ribena. The hall was full with blue-blazed pupils, and the low, incoherent buzz of multiple conversations filled the space. The air was filled with the aromas of various food items being offered by the dinner ladies that day. Beef sausages, chicken curry, grilled turbot, all battling to dominate the sense of smell, creating a whirling, pungent atmosphere of oils, tang, and spice. "Well," said Mr. Talbot, slicing into a sausage and piling mash onto his fork, "let's see if this monstrous din rises up today. If it does, then this is a good place to address all of the children at once, before the weekend. And I've ordered Mrs. Honeydew to photocopy a letter I composed to send home to the parents." "I'm sure it's just a silly trend," Miss Winter suggested, "just like when they were wearing those beer bottle caps on their shoes, and when all the boys were tucking their ties into their shirts. It'll become boring to them soon enough, and they'll wait for the next ridiculous gimmick to come along." Mr. Evans rubbed his beard and shook his head. "No, not a trend, this one, Beverly. It's something else entirely. It almost seems to be, for want of a less dramatic, contagious. It started with that Holland boy, and now half the bloody school are doing it." "I think it's all about the empathy of the child's soul," Mr. Halby said, pushing a piece of fish around his plate absent-mindedly. "This sound, this lamentation, they're somehow passing the feelings of sadness and sympathy between themselves and expressing those feelings with the basest of noises. It's quite remarkable, actually. No offence, Mr. Halby, but that's poppycock. I was there when Mark Holland started this whole nonsense, and I assure you there was no sympathy involved. It was a horrible and mocking thing. The lamentation, more like the cruel." Mrs. Dodd sat back after a little outburst, not even realizing she had leaned quite so far forward whilst talking, and felt the quick heat of a flush in her cheeks. "Anyway, if you will excuse me, I do need to pop across to the chemist before lunch is over and pick up a prescription." She stood, gathered her plates and cutlery, and dropped them into a plastic bin on her way out of the hall, handbag swinging from the crook of an elbow. "See what you did, Andrew," said Mr. Evans, pointing a fork with a piece of chicken pierced on the tines of his colleague. "Poor woman couldn't get out of here fast enough. Prescription my arse." She was absolutely traumatized that day with the Holland lad, and you calling it a good thing is not going to help. "I agree with her too. It's a bloody disease is what it is." "Language, Timothy." Mr. Talbot lowered his head and surveyed the table over the top of his spectacles. "There are children around us, in case you had forgotten." A loud clatter sounded across the hall as one of the dinner ladies dropped a big empty metal serving dish to the tiled floor. All the teachers inhaled sharply and held their breath for a moment. The sound they dreaded immediately started to rise as child after child stood and began to wail. Table by table, the students stood and joined the cacophony, staring and pointing in the direction of the unfortunate dinner lady, who stood silent and still, horrified. Mr. Talbot took in the scene for a short while, utterly bemused, before pushing himself up from the table and shouting at the children to stop it and sit down. He couldn't make his voice heard over the awful noise, even when shouting. "You lot, don't just sit there, help me with them." Mr. Talbot slammed both fists into the tabletop as he berated his teaching staff at the top of his lungs. Everyone quickly rose and dispersed around the room, clapping their hands and yelling for silence. Eileen Dodd sat in the small cafe down the road from the school, drinking a large mug of tea and chain-smoking a pack of Benson and Hedges. trying to calm down. Andrew Helby was an infuriating buffoon on the best of days, but his attempts to explain away that bloody horrible noise as an act of good had really rattled her cage. She blew smoke from her nose with a big huff, shaking her head, knowing she shouldn't let herself get so wound up by the man. There was a rumble as one of the town's signature cream and maroon double-decker buses passed by in the street, and Eileen placed a hand against the window, felt the vibrations in the glass. Right, Eileen, finish this tea and get back to it. No more being Mardy over Helby. He's always going to be an annoying idiot, just like a dog is always going to bark when the postman comes, not worth the stress. She put a cigarette out in a ceramic ashtray with a series of stabbing motions and gulped the last of the tea. As she stood up to leave, a great crashing noise came from down the road. A terrible screech, glass breaking, people screaming, causing everyone, both in the cafe and on the street, to turn their heads towards the commotion. It had felt like the whole building shook. That sounded like it came from the school, said a waitress, peering through the window, and Eileen was out of the door in a flash, joining a number of people who were already hurrying up the road towards the source of the commotion. As she neared the corner, a new sound joined the screams and moans, overpowering them, that infernal drone, the cruel. A heavy sense of dread soared Eileen's belly as she rounded the corner, and the deep red brick of the school buildings lent a hard backdrop to the scene ahead. The black and grey undercarriage of the bus she had seen just a minute earlier was exposed and facing in her direction, the bus having tipped over onto its side. The two left side wheels were now up in the air, spinning around, going nowhere. There was glass all over the street, shards glinting in the sunlight, whilst the heads and the shoulders of several passengers emerged from the broken windows of the bus, some of them bloodied, some waving their hands for help, as they struggled to pull themselves up and out of the toppled vehicle. Groans, screams and cries came from inside the bus, where Eileen imagined most of the people on board would be piled up against the side of the vehicle that now lay against the street itself. The poor people upstairs would have been hit a lot harder than those down below, she thought. Worse than all of this, though, was what greeted Eileen as she moved around the back of the bus towards the terrible noise. It was so loud she actually placed her hands over her ears. A river of blue filled the road. Every single pupil from the school, it seemed, standing in columns, mouths wide open as they howled. In the very front, nearest to the crash, stood the teachers. Talbot, Winter, Helby, even though Mr. Evans, every last one of them. Right arms outstretched, index fingers pointing forwards, eyes wide. The cruel issued forth from the adults far louder and harsher than anything the children were capable of. She noticed with a quick horror that made her sweat and feel cold all at the same time, that the anxious and curious bystanders who had rushed to the scene with her were one by one moving towards the back of the bus and lining up with the children and teachers, raising their arms and joining in with the terrible hell howl. Old ladies with blue rinses out shopping for soup, shopkeepers in aprons and bakers' jackets, young families out for lunch in the local eateries, even a solitary policeman who had been riding by on his bicycle, all took their place in the chorus of hate. Eileen knew she had to get as far away as she could and turned to run as fast as she could. Her feet disobeyed her intentions and stayed stuck to the ground as she tried to turn, resulting in a horrible twisting face plant. Before she could even acknowledge the loose teeth in her jaws and the blood pouring from a smashed nose, she was crawling towards the abominable choir, hand over hand and elbow over elbow. She felt her wrecked mouth open wide to its fullest extent, and all hope was lost. So that's just one of many short stories from Tales from the Lake, Volume 3. So you guys can check out the links below for more info. And you can join us on Patreon to fund this project. Cool. See you later.